My basic hypothesis is that we don't build enough houses because we have lots of regulations that stop us from building. Some of them are around zoning, which are rules about, you can't build up or you can't build on this field or whatever. There are other rules as well about like the design of the building and things like that are also important. Or in the US, they have rules about you have to have union employed staff make the building, which drives up costs. So it's not all zoning, but zoning is a really, really important part of it. And what this article points out is that before the existence of the motor car, there was a huge amount of movement into cities from the countryside. In the 19th century, cities suddenly boom. Some cities in the UK grow by 10 times in 100 years. Some cities, like Chicago, grew by something like 1,000 times, from obviously a tiny, tiny, tiny number. But essentially, it was like doubling every few years. It was unbelievably fast growth. And this is true all across the Western world, Europe and the US. People are moving into cities. And what's happening is parts of the city, residential areas that are relatively prosperous, relatively nice, leafy, kind of nice suburbs, basically, never remain so, because the influx of people always means that anywhere that's nice, it becomes quite profitable to take a family home and turn it into either apartments or subdivide it, so take the rooms and turn them into kind of tenement rooms. And the people who lived in these places didn't like that because their nice area, which was sort of probably safe and clean and didn't have much disease, urban disease was a huge problem in the 19th century, was sort of becoming a slum. And there was this just sort of never-ending process of slum, kind of places becoming slums that had been nice. And so originally, what happened was there were loads of private agreements, private covenants, restricted covenants they're called, that would basically say all the homeowners in this area agree that you're not allowed to subdivide or agree that you're not allowed to build up. In the US, a lot of these were racial, by the way. So a lot of these were about you're not allowed to allow East Asian, Chinese people or black people in some cases into this area. You're not allowed to sell to them or rent to them. In Europe, it was not racial. It was entirely class, income. And basically, these homeowners wanted to protect their area. In some ways, completely legitimately. It is entirely legitimate to want to not have like diseased, like 10 families crammed into the house next door to you if they're going to bring disease and things like that. In other ways, very illegitimately, which obviously relates to things like race. Anyway, these rules emerged. Over time, for various reasons I won't get into, these rules stopped being enforceable and it stopped being possible to enforce them. It relates to basically things like they used to have a single owner, that all the land used to be owned by one person who would enforce this in order to kind of to maintain the value of the area. Then once that started to fracture and people started to own their own plot, you started to get a free rider problem where basically nobody is actually willing to bring a lawsuit because it's too expensive and everybody else benefits from the lawsuit. Anyway, this falls apart. And so as these rules break down to preserve the areas and to kind of keep them nice in some ways that I think most modern people would agree. It's nice not to have like disease in your area, and also nice in ways that we would hopefully all say are terrible and all say should not be allowed at all. The demand grew for local government to do this instead. So the demand grew, like, we can't do this privately, we can't do this via contracts anymore. We need local government to have some rules about, we just don't want our family neighborhood turning into a slum. And that is seemingly the origin of these rules. And why this matters is that it tells us that the reason that we have these rules today is at least in large part about preserving some character of an area or preserving the nature of an area and making the area that you live in more like, or retain features that you like about it, than it is about kind of some sort of general desire to restrict house building. Some people think that like the reason that we have these restrictions is that people, that the value of their home will fall, and so there's a kind of big collective conspiracy to stop houses from being built. I don't think there's actually very much evidence. I don't think that actually makes much sense. Like, for one thing, almost all political parties campaign and promise to build more houses, if there was like a general nationwide feeling that they didn't want houses to be built to preserve the value of their homes, like why would political parties should go up and say, hey, guess what? We're not going to build any houses. We're going to demolish some, and all you homeowners are going to get even richer. That doesn't happen. People, I don't think, actually really understand supply and demand well enough for that even to be possible, even if they did want that. Anyway, so what this suggests, I think, is that people are interested in preserving the nature and pleasantness of the area that they live in, and they are often very concerned, often rightly, that new housing in their area will make their area less nice. Might make it higher crime if people come in, who are maybe younger or whatever. It might make more congestion on the roads. It might mean more pollution. It might mean more noise. Depending on who comes in, yada yada yada. It's really, 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 really important to understand that, because once we know that, then we can start to, okay, now we know what you care about. Now we know what you want. How can we design rules that allow us to build more housing, at least in some places, that don't do those things? What can we do so that the great majority of people's objections that are like pretty reasonable can be met or can be dealt with in some way that still allows us to get houses built? We'll talk about what that might look like in a minute. Elsewhere, I think it's a similar impulse that's kind of taken on a life of its own. So when it comes to building railways and transit and kind of building big infrastructure projects, and when it comes to building things like nuclear power plants, or primarily nuclear, because gas and things like that and coal have lots of problems to do with the environment that nuclear doesn't have. The objections that people have are kind of similar. They're not exactly the same, but they're about preserving nature, and they're about preserving, they look to the 19th century and they look to the kind of the era of industrialization, and they see that in many ways that was very bad for the environment. It ended up being good in the long run, but there were like periods where it was very bad, and they don't want that, and they want to preserve nature. And as people have gotten richer, they've become more and more attached to the preservation of nature and the protection of nature. That has now come to kind of crazy conclusions where, like, you may not do anything. Like you can't like even disturb a nesting bird. Like literally, you can't disturb nesting seagulls if you want to build a nuclear power plant in the UK, which is a really big problem because they need to build them by the sea, and there happen to be a lot of seagulls there. But the common cause is, I think, a desire to preserve things, often good things that are legitimate, that has become really inflexible and has become immune to trade-offs and immune to kind of negotiation or cost-benefit analysis. So sorry, that's a very long way of saying that, but I think it's very important because by understanding where these problems come from, that's how we can begin to solve them. If I move into an area that is really good for kids, and is really like nice for my kids to play outside, I think it's fair for me to say I don't want that to change. Like where you live, where you live is important, not just for economic reasons, but also for like family reasons and social reasons and things like that. And I think that it is entirely reasonable for people to have some stake in their area. Like externalities, concept in economics, like your behavior and your actions can affect lots of other people. Sometimes, we often think of that as being about pollution, but there are lots and lots of things that we do that have externalities. The trouble is when externalities are dealt with in a kind of all or nothing way, where we say, you may not ever pollute in any way, which would mean like we have no industry, we have no production, or we say you may not ever build in a way that changes an area that's good for families or good for kids. Really what we want is to be able to say there are some projects where the loss is worth it, and what we need is mechanisms that allow us to identify, or allow kind of people to identify, not necessarily the state or not necessarily central government, people to identify where those places are, and for that to be where the building happens. Obviously, this is somewhat subjective, but a lot of people would agree with me that buildings that we built up to about 100 years ago, or maybe up to 90 years ago, were built in a style that is much easier to like than a lot of buildings that have been built since, let's say, the 1940s. there are many reasons for that. I think one reason for that is that the taste of the people who design buildings and the taste of people who approve buildings has changed and has become more avant-garde and more interested in like self-referential, like doing things that are shocking or doing things that are like progressive, and not progressive in the political sense, but progressive in the kind of artistic sense of like pushing the discipline forward, rather than doing things that they used to do 100 years ago. Pastiche. Pastiche is like a dirty word to artists and to architects. But actually most normal people like pastiche. Like most normal people don't care if something is authentic or not, or they don't care if it's artistically progressive. They just care if it looks good. And one of the things I think is interesting about architecture is it's one of the very few art forms that you don't really have a choice in experiencing. You don't really have to listen to music you don't want to. You don't really have to watch films you don't want to. You can change the channel if something's on TV that you don't want to look at. But with architecture, with a building, it's often very inconvenient to not see a building, especially if you live near it. So one of the factors is, I think, this change in taste among people who decide what buildings look like. Partly it's also to do with economics. It's cheaper to build like big glass towers than it is to build like big stone towers. It's actually not as much cheaper as people assume. Actually, mass production of ornament we have a long history of doing mass produced ornament that's very, very, very cheap. But that is a factor. I don't want to kind of sound like I'm ruling that out. And anyway, the upshot of this is most people have a pretty rational expectation that a new building, a new development near them is not going to look very good, and might look really bad, and might also be built in a way that's not particularly human friendly. So it might be built in a way that doesn't have much on the street level. So people walking by are just walking by like anonymous flat glass, panes of glass, rather than stuff that has different shape and has stuff to look at and has like doorways that they can go by. Like there's a lot of interesting work by the group Create Streets in the UK that looks at like what actually do people like from buildings. And it's not all about stuff being traditional versus stuff being new. There are specific features that you tend to find in newer styles that you don't find in older styles that often tend to be quite alienating and quite kind of anonymous, if I can use that word. So I think people do have basically a pretty rational expectation that a new building is going to look worse and it's going to look bad and it might make the area uglier and less nice to be in. And so if that's true, then, well, that's a reason that they might object in the same way they'd object to a new development because it might make the area more noisy or make the area more polluted or congested or something.
And they probably don't want to live in
and they probably don't want to live next to it, right? Like, yeah, they probably don't want to live next to it. I mean, I live in an area in London that has some really old, really, I would say, quite beautiful Georgian and Victorian buildings, and some it was heavily bombed in the war, and what was built in place of the stuff that was bombed is ugly. And there are streets where on the one side you have stunning Victorian homes, and on the other side you have incredibly ugly, badly made, badly built flats. And it's entirely understandable that people would say, like, if you're building the stuff on the right, I don't want that. I'm going to object. And if you don't do that, if you give them like, actually, no, we're going to build something really beautiful, something like really, really nice to walk by every day, then I'm not saying that will turn everybody into a kind of pro-housing person, but I think it will weaken their opposition and make them more accepting of it.